The wind scraped across the plains like a dull blade, carrying the scent of dry sage and distant rain that never came. Elias reined in his horse at the edge of a shallow draw, the animal's flanks heaving under the relentless sun. His throat burned raw from dust and thirst, and the weight of his saddlebags felt like stones against his aching back. He had ridden for days without seeing another soul, the land stretching out indifferent, a vast emptiness that mirrored the hollow in his chest. The frontier had taken everything from him, once his brother to fever, his land to drought, and now it seemed content to let him wander a ghost among the junipers and scrub. He dismounted slowly, knees protesting, and led the horse to a trickle of water seeping from cracked earth. The stream was barely enough to wet his kerchief, but he knelt anyway, cupping the coolness to his lips. It tasted of minerals and regret. Far off, a coyote yipped, the sound echoing lonely across the ridges. Elias straightened his hand, brushing the revolver at his hip, more habit than need. He was 42, weathered like old leather, with calluses that spoke of years breaking horses and mending fences that the wind always tore down again. As he remounted, a faint cry caught the wind, not animal but human, thinned, desperate. He paused, scanning the horizon where the draw deepened into a gully, shadowed by cottonwoods. Something moved there, a flicker of color against the brown. Urging his horse forward, he descended the slope, the ground crunching under hooves. The air grew thicker with the smell of unwashed cloth and fear. At the bottom, huddled against a fallen log, was a cluster of figures. Children, 5 of them, ragged and wide-eyed, their faces smeared with dirt. The oldest, a boy of maybe 12, stood protectively in front, clutching a stick like a weapon. Behind him, 2 girls clutched each other, their dresses torn at the hems, and a smaller boy whimpered, softly, rubbing his eyes. The youngest, a girl no more than 6, peered out from the group, her hair matted and eyes sunken. And there, rising unsteadily from where she knelt, was a woman. She was slight, her frame worn thin by hardship, but her gaze held a fierce spark. Her dress, once blue, was faded to gray, clinging to her like a second skin in the heat. Strands of dark hair escaped her braid, framing a face etched with exhaustion. She placed a hand on the oldest boy's shoulder, pulling him back gently, her other arm wrapping around the whimpering child. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with wariness. The wind tugged at her skirt, revealing bare feet blistered from walking. Elias raised his hands slowly, palms out. "Name's Elias Thorne. Just passing through." Heard a cry. His eyes flicked to the children, noting their hollow cheeks, the way the little ones trembled, not just from cold but from something deeper. The woman studied him, her lips pressed thin. "We're fine. Keep riding." But the youngest girl tugged at her mother's hem, whispering something Elias couldn't catch. The woman shushed her, but the child persisted, her voice carrying on the breeze. "We haven't eaten in days." The words hung there, small and devastating, like a pebble starting an avalanche. Elias felt them land in his gut, heavy as lead. The land's indifference cracked open in that moment, revealing the raw ache beneath. He had seen starvation before, in the eyes of his brother wasting away in a fevered bed, begging for water that wouldn't save him. Memories flooded unbidden, the ranch house silent after the burial, the empty table where laughter used to sit, the way he'd ridden out one dawn and never looked back. He swallowed his throat tight. "Got some jerky in my bags. Hardtack too. Ain't much, but it'll do." The woman's eyes narrowed, suspicion warring with desperation. The oldest boy gripped his stick tighter, but the little girl stepped forward, her small hand outstretched, hope flickering in her gaze. Elias dismounted again, moving slow, deliberate. He untied a pouch from his saddle, pulling out strips of dried beef, the salt-crusted edges rough against his fingers. The scent of it filled the air, and he saw the children's nostrils flare, their bodies leaning in despite themselves. "Here," he said, holding it out to the girl. She took it hesitantly, then tore into it with tiny teeth, her siblings crowding close as she shared. The woman watched, her arms crossed tight over her chest as if holding herself together. "Why?" she asked quietly, the word laced with the weight of betrayals past. Elias met her eyes, seeing the storm there, abandonment, perhaps, or loss that mirrored his own. "Because I know what empty feels like," he replied, his voice low, the wind carrying it away like so much dust. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and knelt to help the children eat. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gully, the cottonwoods rustling softly as if in witness. Elias stood there, the horse nickering behind him, wondering if this was the frontier's way of offering redemption or just another burden to carry. There are many more untold stories waiting on Wild West Chronicles. The children ate slowly at first, as if afraid the food might vanish if they moved too fast. The little girl Clara, her mother called her, chewed with both hands, cradling the strip of jerky eyes, never leaving Elias's face. The oldest boy, Caleb, broke his piece in half and gave the larger share to his sister beside him, a girl of about 10 named Ruth, whose braids hung in dusty ropes. The middle boy, Samuel, barely 7, licked salt from his fingers between bites, while the youngest boy, Jonah, simply held his portion to his chest like something precious he might lose. Elias watched from a respectful distance, leaning against his horse's warm shoulder. The woman, her name was Mara, she said after a long silence, sat cross-legged on the ground, tearing small pieces for the littlest ones. Her movements were careful practice, the way a person learns to ration when there's never enough. She didn't thank him. Not yet. Gratitude, he knew, could feel like debt, and she already carried more than one person should. When the last crumb was gone, Caleb wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve and looked up. "You got more, Caleb," Mara said sharply, but there was no real heat in it. Elias shook his head. "Not enough for a whole winter. But there's a homestead 2 days east, near the fork of the Platte. They trade sometimes. Might have flour, maybe beans." Mara's gaze lifted. "We're headed west, California if the trail holds." He studied the horizon where the sun bled red into the ridges. "Trail's thin this year. Grass is gone, water's scarcer. Folks are turning back." "We don't turn back," she said, the words flat final. He nodded once, respecting the steel in her voice, even if he didn't understand it yet. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke, someone's distant campfire, or lightning that had found dry grass. Elias felt the old restlessness stir in him, the urge to mount up and ride until the ache in his chest dulled again. But the children were still watching him, and Clara had edged closer, her small boots scuffing the dirt. "You hurt?" she asked, pointing at the faded scar that ran along his left forearm, visible where he'd rolled up his sleeve to wash. "Old wound," he said. "Horse threw me years back. Bone came through." She winced, sympathetic. "Did it hurt bad? Like fire?" he admitted. "But it healed." Mara stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "We should move before dark. Snakes come out." Elias glanced at the sky. "You won't make far tonight. There's a spring 1/2 mile north, good grass for the night." "I was headed that way myself." She hesitated, weighing him against the night, coming on cold and the children already swaying on their feet. Finally, she gave a small nod. "We'll follow. But we keep our own fire." "Fair enough." He helped load what little they carried: 2 threadbare blankets, a dented kettle, a burlap sack half full of nothing much. Mara lifted Jonah onto her hip without strain, though her arms trembled afterward. Elias offered his hand to Ruth. She took it after a glance at her mother, her fingers small and cool in his rough palm. They walked in silence, the horse trailing behind with its slow, patient gait. The spring appeared as a green wound in the brown land, ringed by willows that whispered in the evening breeze. Elias unsaddled the horse and hobbled it near the water, while Mara settled the children on a flat patch of grass. She built a small fire with twigs. Caleb gathered her hand steady, despite the fatigue carving lines around her eyes. Elias added larger branches from his own stock, careful not to crowd her space. When the flames caught, they sat on opposite sides. The children curled together under the blankets, exhaustion claiming them fast. Clara lay with her head on Ruth's lap, already asleep, thumb near her mouth like she was still small enough for comfort. Mara stared into the fire. "Their father left us outside Independence," she said at last, voice so quiet it nearly drowned in the crackle. "Said he'd scout ahead, find better land. Never came back. That was 3 months ago." Elias felt the familiar twist in his gut. "I lost a brother to the trail. Fever. Took him quick. Buried him under an oak so the coyotes wouldn't find him easy. She looked at him, then really looked, searching for pity or judgment. Finding neither, she exhaled slowly. I keep thinking if I'd been stronger faster, he might stayed. Men leave for their own reasons, Elias said. Ain't ever about the ones left behind. The fire popped, sending sparks upward like brief stars. Mara pulled her knees to her chest. I don't know how to keep them alive much longer. You're still walking, he said simply. That's more than most. She gave a small, bitter laugh. Walking toward nothing, maybe. He didn't argue. Instead, he pulled a tin cup from his saddlebag, filled it at the spring, and set it near the coals to warm. When it steamed faintly, he offered it to her. She took it, wrapping both hands around the metal as if drawing heat into her bones. They sat like that until the fire burned low, the night settling cold and quiet around them. Somewhere an owl called, soft and mournful. Elias felt the weight of the children's breathing, the woman's careful silence, and for the first time in years, the emptiness inside him didn't feel quite so wide. The next morning broke cold and gray, the kind of light that made every shadow look deeper than it was. Elias woke first, the ache in his shoulders sharper after sleeping on hard ground. He built up the fire from last night's embers, coaxing flames with dry willow twigs until coffee could boil. The smell drifted rich and bitter, pulling the children from sleep one by one. Clara sat up, rubbing her eyes, hair wild around her small face. She watched Elias pour the dark liquid into his only tin cup, then into the dented kettle for Mara. When he offered the cup to the girl, she shook her head. Mama first, she said solemnly. Mara accepted it without protest, cradling the warmth against her chest. Their eyes met over the steam for a moment, brief, unguarded, before she looked away. They broke camp quietly. Elias saddled his horse while Caleb helped fold the blanket's movements, stiff but willing. Ruth carried Jonah piggyback when the boy's legs gave out after a few steps. Samuel trailed close behind Mara, clutching the hem of her skirt like a lifeline. No one spoke of the day before, of hunger or fathers who vanished. The silence felt necessary, like resting a sprained limb. By noon, the land had opened into rolling swells of grass gone gold with autumn. The wind still carried dust, but it smelled cleaner here, less like despair. Elias pointed out a line of antelope moving parallel to them, pale ghosts against the horizon. Meat, if we needed it, he said. But they're fast, and we're slow. Mara glanced at the children. We're slow because we're careful. He nodded. Careful was a language he understood. They stopped at midday under a lone cottonwood whose leaves had turned the color of old gold coins. Mara spread one blanket in the shade, and the children collapsed onto it, too tired to play. Elias hobbled the horse to graze, and then walked the perimeter, checking for sign tracks, broken branches, anything that might mean trouble. When he returned, Mara was sitting apart, knees drawn up, staring at nothing. He settled a respectful distance away, back against the trunk. After a while, she spoke without turning. You don't ask questions. Figured you'd tell what you wanted to. She gave a small, dry laugh. Most men would ask by now. Where we came from. Why we're alone. What I plan to do with 5 children and no husband. I've seen enough trails to know the answers don't always matter. She finally looked at him. You lost someone too. Brother, he said again, the word still heavy after all these years. And a wife once. Long time back. She wanted children. I couldn't give her any that lived. The admission came out quieter than he intended, raw at the edges. Mara didn't flinch or offer pity. She simply nodded, as if adding another stone to the cairn they were building between them. I married young, she said. Thought it would keep me safe. Turns out, safety's just another word for waiting to be left. They sat with that truth a while, the cottonwood leaves rattling overhead like dry paper. A hawk circled high, its shadow sliding across them once, then gone. When the children stirred, Elias taught Caleb how to check the horse's hooves for stones, how to run a hand down each leg, feeling for heat or swelling. The boy listened hard, repeating the steps under his breath. Ruth asked about the revolver at Elias's hip. He showed her how the cylinder turned, how the hammer clicked without a cartridge. Samuel wanted to know why the horse's ears flicked at every sound. Clara simply stayed near Mara, watching everything with serious eyes. Late in the afternoon, they reached a shallow creek lined with choke cherries still clinging to the branches, dark and shriveled but sweet enough after days of nothing. Mara showed the children how to pick them without tearing the thin skin, how to roll them between fingers to test for ripeness. Elias joined them tall among the low bushes, dropping handfuls into the kettle until it was half full. They ate sitting in a loose circle on the bank juice, staining small fingers purple. Clara offered Elias the fattest berry she'd saved, holding it out on her open palm like a gift. He took it carefully, tasting the sharp burst of summer trapped inside winter fruit. That night they camped beside the creek. The fire burned brighter with driftwood. Elias gathered and Mara hummed a tune under her breath while she mended a tear in Jonah's shirt with a bone needle and thread unraveled from an old hem. Elias sharpened his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape blending with the water's murmur. When the children slept, Mara moved to sit closer to the flames. Elias stayed where he was giving her space. "I keep waiting for you to ride off," she said after a long quiet. "Like the rest. I keep waiting for you to tell me to go," he answered. She looked at him across the firelight, the glow catching the faint scar above her left eyebrow, the weariness in the set of her mouth. "I don't want to be alone with them anymore." The words hung plain and unguarded. Elias felt something shift inside him, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, like a river finding a new channel after years of drought. "Then don't be," he said. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for another stick to feed the fire, watching it catch and curl. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "We'll see what tomorrow brings." He nodded once. Tomorrow was enough for now. The days began to fold into one another like pages in a worn book. They traveled steadily eastward now, the original westward pull, forgotten in the small, practical rhythm of survival. Elias led on foot much of the time, reins loose in his hand, letting the horse pick its way while the children took turns riding double. Mara walked beside him when her strength allowed, though her pace had slowed the blisters on her feet, wrapped in strips, torn from an old petticoat. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of tarnished silver, promising rain that held off until evening. They made camp in a shallow bowl of land where bunchgrass grew thick enough to cushion sleep. While Elias scouted for firewood, Mara sat with the children, teaching them to braid cord from dried yucca leaves, something useful, something to keep idle hands busy and minds from wandering too far into worry. When he returned with an armload of dry juniper, he found Caleb trying to copy her knot's tongue between his teeth in concentration. Ruth watched closely, then reached for a length of cord herself. Samuel and Jonah played nearby, stacking small stones into wobbly towers, while Clara sat in the circle's center, turning a length of yucca between her fingers until it frayed into threads. Elias dropped the wood and knelt to help Caleb tighten a loop. Their hands brushed rough against small and careful, and the boy looked up, startled but not pulling away. "Like this," Elias said, guiding the boy's fingers. "Pull steady, not hard. Rope remembers how you treat it." Caleb nodded, repeating the motion until the knot held firm. Mara watched from across the small fire ring, her expression unreadable in the fading light. That night, the rain finally came, soft at first, then steady, drumming on the oilcloth Elias had strung between two willows. The children huddled beneath it, dry and warm, while Mara and Elias sat just outside the shelter's edge, backs to the trunk, letting the drops fall on their hats and shoulders. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked after a long stretch of listening to the rain. "Stopping where? Anywhere. A place with a roof. A garden, maybe. Somewhere the wind don't always win." He considered it, the idea, foreign after so many years of motion. Thought about it once. Built a cabin near the Powder River. Stayed 2 winters. Then the snow came heavy and the roof caved. Took what was left and kept going. She turned her face toward him, rain tracing clean paths down her cheek. "You didn't try again, didn't see the point. Things break. People leave. Easier to travel light." Mara was quiet so long he thought she'd let it drop. Then she said, I used to dream of a house with yellow curtains, windows that let in morning light, a porch where the children could play without watching for snakes. I stopped dreaming it after he left. Figured dreams were just another thing that could be taken. Elias felt the old scar on his forearm throb faintly, an echo of pain long gone. Maybe some things ain't meant to be taken. Maybe they're meant to be built slow, one board at a time. She gave a small, surprised laugh, soft under the rain. You sound like a man who's starting to believe his own words. Maybe I am. The rain eased toward morning, leaving the world washed and shining. They broke camp under a sky clearing to pale blue. Elias noticed Mara moving easier today, the limp less pronounced. When they crossed a low ridge at midday, she paused to look back the way they'd come, miles of grassland rolling away, empty and vast. I keep expecting to see him, she said quietly, coming after us, saying he was wrong. Elias followed her gaze. You want him to know? She answered after a breath. I want him to stay gone, so I can stop waiting. He understood that better than he wanted to. Waiting had carved hollows in him too. That evening they reached a small Mormon settlement, tucked against a line of bluffs, log houses, a sod-roofed meeting hall, laundry flapping on lines like white flags of truce. Elias knew the people here kept to themselves, but weren't unkind to strangers who didn't push. He bartered 2 cured rabbit hides for a sack of cornmeal, a small block of salt, and a jar of preserved peaches that made Clara's eyes go wide. They camped just outside the settlement's edge, respectful of boundaries. After supper, thick corn mush, sweetened with peach syrup, Mara took the children to wash at the creek while Elias tended the horse. When she returned, her hair was wet and braided fresh strands, catching the last of the sun like dark silk. She sat near him on a fallen log, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The children played quietly nearby, chasing fireflies that had begun to rise from the grass. I've been thinking, she said, about what happens when we reach that fork you mentioned, the homestead, the trading post. He waited. I don't want to keep running forever, she continued, but I don't know how to stop either. Not alone. You ain't alone, he said the words simple and sure. She looked at him, then searching his face as if memorizing it. You'd stay with us knowing what we are, 5 children, and a woman with nothing but grit and bad luck. I'd stay, he answered, because of what you are. Not in spite of it. For the first time since he'd found them in the gully, Mara reached out and laid her hand over his where it rested on his knee. Her fingers were cool from the creek, steady despite the tremble he felt beneath the surface. Neither of them moved for a long minute, letting the touch speak what words hadn't yet found. Above them, the first stars appeared faint and far, but growing brighter as the night deepened. The settlement's morning carried the smell of wood smoke and baking bread, faint but unmistakable. Elias rose before first light, leaving Mara and the children still wrapped in blankets. He walked to the trading post, a low sod building with a plank porch, and bartered the last of his cured hides for a sack of flour, a small sack of dried beans, and a tin of lard the storekeeper swore would keep till spring. He paid with the last silver dollar. He carried the coin heavy with finality. When he returned, Mara was already up boiling water over a rekindled fire. The children sat in a row like birds on a fence, watching him approach with the bulging sack. Thought we might stay a day or two, Elias said, setting the supplies down. Rest the feet. Maybe mend what's torn. Mara looked at the sack, then at him. You spent your last dollar. Wasn't doing much good rattling in my pocket. She didn't argue. Instead, she knelt and began sorting the goods, flour into one pile, beans into another, her hands moving with the careful economy of someone who had learned hunger young. Clara crept close, peering into the sack as if it might hold miracles. That day passed in small, deliberate tasks. Elias helped Caleb repair a tear in the largest blanket, showing him how to whip stitch so the seam wouldn't pull apart again. Ruth and Samuel gathered kindling while Jonah followed them, dragging sticks too big for his arms. Mara mixed flour with water and a pinch of the precious lard, patting the dough into flat rounds she baked on a hot stone. The smell of bread, simple warm, drew the children back like a tether. When the first loaves cooled, she broke one open steam rising in fragrant clouds. She handed half to Elias without a word. He took it, tore off a piece, and gave it to Clara first. The girl bit into it slowly, eyes closing, as if tasting something remembered from another life. In the afternoon, Mara walked with Elias to the creek to wash the kettle and refill the canteen. The water ran clear over smooth stones cold enough to sting. They worked in silence until she spoke. "I've been thinking about California again," she said. "Not the dream of it, the real thing. Orchards. A place to plant something and watch it grow. But the trail west is long and winter's coming." Elias dipped the kettle, let the current fill it. "Winter finds you wherever you are. Might as well meet it with a roof." She looked at him sideways. "You saying we should stay? I'm saying we could look for land hereabouts. Good grass. Water close. Folks who don't mind neighbors if they pull their weight." Mara set the kettle on the bank and straightened. "You'd build again after what happened before, build different this time," he said. "With people who stay." She studied his face, the lines carved by sun and grief, the quiet steadiness behind them. Then she reached out, not to touch his hand this time, but to brush a streak of flour from his sleeve. The gesture was small, domestic, intimate in its ordinariness. That evening, the settlement held a gathering in the meeting hall. Lanterns hung from rafters, benches pushed back, a fiddler playing tunes that made the children clap and sway. Mara let them join the circle of dancers, small feet, stamping in time. Elias stood near the door, arms crossed, watching. When Clara ran to him and tugged his hand, he let her pull him into the light. He didn't dance, but he lifted her onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowd, her laughter bright against the music. Later, outside under a sky thick with stars, Mara found him leaning against the hall's wall. The children slept inside on borrowed pallets. The night belonged to the two of them. "I'm scared," she admitted, voice low. "Of hoping again. Of believing this might last." Elias pushed off the wall, stepped closer until the space between them held only breath. "I'm scared too," he said. "Been running from empty so long I forgot what full felt like. But I feel it now. With you. With them." She lifted her face to his. Moonlight traced the curve of her cheek, the faint tremble of her lip. He raised a hand slowly, giving her time to step away. She didn't. His palm settled against her face, thumb brushing the corner of her eye where a tear had gathered. "I want to try," she whispered. "Here. With you." He leaned down and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper, the way a man kisses when he's finally stopped running. She rose on her toes to meet him, hands finding his coat, holding on as if the wind might still carry him away. When they parted, foreheads resting together, the night felt warmer, the stars closer. "We'll find land tomorrow," he said against her hair. "Start small. One room. A fireplace. Room for 5 children and whatever else comes." Mara smiled, small and real. "And yellow curtains," she added. "And yellow curtains." They stood like that until the music inside faded, and the lanterns dimmed, two people who'd been broken separately now choosing quietly to mend together. The days that followed carried the quiet momentum of decision made and not yet regretted. Elias spoke to a deacon at the meeting hall the next morning. Brother Amos, a man with a face like sun-cracked clay and eyes that missed little. He knew of a quarter section 2 miles north, along a bend in the creek where willows grew thick and the soil held black under the grass. Abandoned 2 seasons back when the previous family lost their eldest to cholera and the rest fled east. The claim papers still sat in the land office at the county seat, unfiled but waiting for someone willing to work it. They rode out together that afternoon, Elias on his horse with Caleb riding behind, arms tight around his waist. Mara walked with the younger ones, Ruth carrying Jonah, when the boy tired Samuel and Clara holding hands, like they might lose each other in the open light. The land appeared modest at first glance, a single soddy half caved on one corner, a few fence posts leaning drunk, a patch of garden gone to weeds. But the creek ran steady and the grass stretched far enough to winter a small herd if they could afford seed stock come spring. Elias dismounted and walked the perimeter alone, first boots sinking into soft earth. He knelt at the garden plot, crumbled soil between fingers. It smelled alive, dark and promising. When he returned to the others, Mara stood with arms folded, studying the broken roofline. "Needs work," she said. "Everything worth having does." She nodded slowly. "We could live in the wagon bed till the roof's sound. Patch the walls. Plant what we can before frost." Caleb kicked at a clod. "I can help dig post holes. I'm strong." Elias ruffled the boy's hair. "You are. We'll start tomorrow." That night, they camped on their new claim, the fire built against the soddy's south wall for shelter. Mara cooked beans with the last of the peaches stirred in a small sweetness against the salt. The children ate until their bellies rounded, then curled together under blankets, while the adults sat feeding the fire sticks one at a time. Mara spoke first, voice low. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for someone to ride up and say this isn't ours." Elias stared into the flames. "Might happen. Land's got a way of changing hands when folks aren't looking. But we'll fight for it if we have to. Quiet, like. Lawful." She leaned her head against his shoulder the first time she'd done so without hesitation. "I don't want to fight. I want to build. Then we build." The next weeks blurred into labor and small victories. Elias and Caleb felled young cottonwoods for rafters, stripping bark, while the sap still ran sweet. Mara and Ruth cleared the old garden, turning soil with a borrowed spade until blisters rose and broke and calloused over. Samuel carried water in buckets too big for him, spilling half but never complaining. Jonah and Clara followed behind, dropping bean seeds into the furrows, with careful fingers patting dirt over them like tucking in babies. One evening, Elias found Mara sitting on the half-repaired porch, two planks nailed across stumps, watching the sun drop behind the bluffs. Her hands were raw nails broken, but she held them open in her lap as if studying something new. He sat beside her. "You're smiling. Am I—" She looked down at her hands again. "I think I forgot what it felt like. To be tired from work that matters." He took one of her hands in his, turned it over, traced the new lines etched there. "These'll tell a story someday. Of a woman who didn't quit." She curled her fingers around his. "And a man who stayed." They kissed then, slow and unhurried, the way people kiss when time no longer feels borrowed. The children's voices drifted from inside Ruth, reading aloud from a tattered Bible brother. Amos had given them the words, rising and falling like a lullaby. Winter came gentle that year, snow falling soft and steady rather than in blizzards. The soddy held against the windroof, patched with sod and canvas chimney drawing clean. They kept a milk cow, traded for labor at the settlement, and the garden slept under mulch, dreaming of spring. The children grew taller, cheeks fuller, laughter coming easier. One night in late February, with the wind moaning low outside, Mara woke Elias with a touch on his arm. The children slept soundly on their pallets. The fire burned low but steady. "I'm with child," she whispered. He lay still a moment, letting the words settle. Then he turned to her hand, finding her belly under the quilt. It was still flat, but he felt the promise there, small and fierce. "You're not afraid?" he asked. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "but I'm not alone." He pulled her close, her head tucked under his chin. "We'll make room. One more board. One more cradle." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the claim in quiet white. Inside, the fire popped softly, and 5 children, soon to be 6, breathed in the same warm dark. In the morning light that followed, Elias stepped onto the porch and looked across land that was theirs. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney straight up into still air. Mara joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and together they watched the sun climb, painting the snow gold. Somewhere in the distance, a calf bawled new life, answering the day. Spring arrived reluctant that year, reluctant but sure. the way a person returns home after too long away. The snow melted slow, feeding the creek until it ran full and noisy over stones worn smooth by winters past. Green pushed up through the brown first, the tender shoots of grass, then the bean vines Mara had planted last fall, curling tentative fingers toward light. Elias rose before dawn most mornings boiling coffee while the house still held night's chill. The soddy had grown a second room framed with cottonwood logs, walls chinked with mud and straw, a window Mara had insisted on so morning could find them gentle. Yellow curtains hung there now, cloth dyed with marigold petals she'd gathered last summer stitched by Ruth's careful hands. They moved in the breeze like something alive. The children had changed with the season. Caleb stood nearly as tall as Elias's shoulder voice deepening when he spoke of breaking the new ground for corn. Ruth read aloud every evening from the Bible or the almanac Brother Amos, lent them her words steadying the younger ones through long dark. Samuel trailed Elias like a shadow, learning the names of tools, the feel of a hammer's balance. Jonah, still small, followed Clara everywhere, the two of them building stick forts along the creek bank and whispering secrets only siblings know. Mara carried the new life low and steady. She moved slower now, one hand often resting on the swell beneath her apron, but her eyes held a quiet shine. Elias watched her from the porch, sometimes kneeling in the garden to thin carrot seedlings, laughing when Jonah brought her a handful of wild violets, and felt something settle deep in his chest, a certainty he hadn't known he could still carry. One afternoon in late May, when the cottonwoods released their seeds, in white drifts that caught on every surface, a rider appeared on the southern ridge. Elias saw him first from the field where he and Caleb were planting potatoes. The man rode a bay mare coat dusty from trail miles, hat pulled low. Elias straightened, hand shading his eyes. "Stay here," he told Caleb, and walked to meet the stranger at the edge of the claim. The rider reined in 20 yards out. "Elias Thorne, that's me." The man dismounted slow, respectful. He was older, perhaps 50, face line from sun and something harder. "Name's Harlan Crow. I'm looking for Mara Whitaker, or Mara Crow as she once was." Elias felt the air go still. He kept his stance loose, hand near but not on the revolver. "She's here." "What's your business?" Harlan's gaze flicked past him to the house, the smoke rising thin from the chimney. "She's my daughter. Left home 8 years back with a man who promised her the world. Never heard from her after the first year. Word came down the trail. She was widowed, traveling with children. Then nothing." Elias studied the man. The eyes were Mara's, same steady gray, same guarded depth. "She's not widowed," he said quietly. "Her husband left her on the trail. We've made a life here." Harlan exhaled through his nose. "I ain't come to take her back. Just to know she's breathing. To see the grandbabies I never thought I'd have." From the porch, Mara's voice carried soft but clear. "Papa," she stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other cradling her belly. The children clustered behind her, curious, wary, protective. Harlan's face changed, then cracking open with something raw and unguarded. He took one step, then stopped. Mara walked down the path, slow skirt, brushing new grass. When she reached him, she stopped too close enough to touch, but not yet touching. "You look older," she said. "So, do you?" he answered, voice rough, but stronger. Tears gathered in her eyes but didn't fall. "I waited for a letter. For anything. I wrote. Letters came back unclaimed. After a while, I stopped. Thought you were gone for good." She looked down at the ground between them. "I was for a time." Harlan glanced at Elias, then back to her. "You got a home now. A man who stays." "I do." He nodded, once slow. "That's more than I gave your mother. More than most get." Mara lifted her chin. "Come meet them. The children, and the one coming." The afternoon unfolded gentle. Harlan sat on the porch with coffee, Mara poured, answering small questions from Ruth and Samuel, letting Jonah climb onto his knee without protest. Clara watched from Mara's lap thumb in her mouth until Harlan pulled a small, carved wooden horse from his pocket, yellow pine smoothed by years, and placed it in her hand. She closed her fingers around it like a promise kept. When evening came, and the sky turned the color of ripe peaches, Harlan stood to leave. Mara walked him to his horse. "You could stay," she said. "There's room." He shook his head. "Got my own place south of here, but I'll come back. Bring seed stock. Help with the harvest if you'll have me." She reached out, then laid her palm against his weathered cheek. "We'll have you." He covered her hand with his own, held it a moment. Then he mounted, tipped his hat to Elias, standing on the porch, and rode south into the falling light. Mara returned to Elias, slipping her arm through his. They watched until the rider became a speck, then nothing. "He came," she whispered. "He did." She leaned into him, head on his shoulder. "We're not alone anymore. Not any of us." Inside, the children's voices rose in soft argument over whose turn it was to hold the wooden horse. The fire crackled. Outside, the first stars appeared steady above land that held them all. Elias kissed the top of her head. "Come inside. Supper's waiting." They turned together, stepping across the threshold into warmth and light, and the small, fierce sounds of family. The summer stretched long and golden, the kind that makes you forget how short the growing season truly is. Corn tassels whispered in the breeze, beans climbed their poles in green spirals, and the garden produced more than they could eat: tomatoes heavy enough to split their skins, squash that rolled from vines like fat green moons. Mara preserved what they couldn't consume: fresh glass jars, lining the new shelves Elias built along the Saudi's north wall, each lid sealed with the satisfying pop of success. The baby came in the last week of July, on a night so still the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Mara labored through the dark hours with Ruth and a neighbor woman from the settlement, Sister Ellen, who had birthed 7 of her own, while Elias waited outside with the boys pacing the porch boards he'd planned himself. Caleb sat on the steps, sharpening a stick he didn't need. Samuel hugged his knees. Jonah slept against Elias's thigh. When the thin cry finally cut the night, Elias felt his own breath release, like a knot coming undone. He entered the room, quiet, hat already off. Mara lay against pillows, sweat-damp hair clinging to her forehead, but her smile was steady when she looked up. "A girl," she said. "Healthy. Loud." Elias crossed to the bed in 3 steps. Sister Ellen stepped aside with a nod, and he knelt. The baby was small, red-faced fists, clenched as if still fighting to arrive. Mara placed her in his arms, and the weight so little, so fierce, nearly undid him. "Name?" he asked, voice rough. Mara touched the dark wisp of hair on the tiny head. "Lydia. After my mother." "Lydia," he repeated, tasting the sound. The baby blinked up at him with eyes still cloudy, then yawned, pink mouth wide. Something cracked open inside Elias, then not pain, but its opposite, a wide, quiet place where hope could finally root. The children filed in one by one. Clara climbed onto the bed, first peering at her new sister with solemn wonder. Ruth touched Lydia's cheek with one careful finger. Samuel whispered, "She's smaller than a kitten." Jonah reached out, then pulled back shy. Caleb hung back near the door until Elias beckoned him closer. "She's ours," Elias said simply. Caleb nodded, throat working, then stepped forward and laid his hand, already calloused from summer work, on the blanket covering the baby's feet. Days afterward blurred into the soft routine of new life. Mara healed, slow but sure, resting when the others insisted, feeding Lydia in the yellow-curtained room while sunlight pooled on the floorboards. Elias took the older children into the fields, teaching them to scythe hay, to mend fence where cattle had leaned too hard. Harlan arrived twice that month, bringing a heifer and calf and a crate of laying hens. He stayed long enough to help raise the barn frame sleeves rolled, laughing at Jonah's attempts to swing a mallet bigger than his arm. One evening in early September, with harvest half done, and the air already carrying the first bite of frost they gathered on the porch after supper. The sky burned orange and rose behind the bluffs. Lydia nursed at Mara's breast under a light shawl. The other children sprawled on the steps, passing the carved wooden horse from hand to hand, arguing gently over whose turn came next. Elias sat beside Mara on the bench he'd built wide enough for two. He reached for her free hand, threaded his fingers through hers. "Never thought I'd see this," he said low. "A porch. Children. A baby sleeping in the crook of your arm." Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd stop walking." They watched the light fade the land, turning soft and shadowed. Somewhere down the creek, a killdeer called plaintive and familiar. The cow loud once from the new corral, answered by the calf's higher bleat. Harlan had left that morning with a promise to return for the corn shucking. Brother Amos had stopped by yesterday with news of a school starting come winter 3 days a week in the meeting hall, enough to give Ruth and Caleb letters and figures beyond what Mara could teach alone. The claim felt solid now, not just lines on a map, but roots going down holding against wind and want. Mara shifted Lydia to her shoulder, patting gently until a small burp escaped. "Think we'll make it through another winter." Elias looked out across the fields, stubble gold, under the last light hay stacked in neat shocks, the house standing square and warm behind them. "We already have," he said. "The rest is just living it." She turned her face up to his. He kissed her, then slow, deliberate, tasting salt and sweetness and years yet to come. When they parted, her eyes shone quiet and sure. Inside, Clara began to sing a hymn. Ruth had taught her voice high and clear. The others joined, halting at first, then stronger. The notes drifted out the open door, mingling with cricket song and the rustle of cottonwood leaves. Elias squeezed Mara's hand once more. They rose together, stepping back across the threshold into lamplight and the small clamor of family laughter, questions, the soft fussing of a newborn settling to sleep. Outside, the stars came out one by one, bright above land that had